Part of me wishes that I had been able to bring a mug of tea from the apartment.
Was that? Part of me wishes that I'd been able to bring a mug of tea from the apartment. Aha! See? We haven't bumped into each other yet. Just so you know, we've got some spare pins up there if anyone wants to grab some swag. So arc pins, drifter pins, and Zyme Biotech, because, you know, very Oh, and we also have extra associate badges for people who want to take them home to anyone. Like if you know some niche nerds who weren't able to make a Fanfest. So. Yes, indeed. So we're going to disappear now. We're going to disappear.
That's what we came for.
Yeah, that's what you do at the end. Yeah, they say the whole thing, and then they get the swag. You know, I had just burns, so I just sort of figured, you know, yeah. you guys something to do? Give me something. Technically, I remember technically, I remember.
No, that is not. No. Okay, well, so it goes.
Hey, Makoto. Yeah. Stop insulting Cavalry officer. You can tell it's not the original because it's not a thick Russian accent.
Oh yeah, no. And the grammar is actually wait, no, the grammar is bad.
It's intentionally bad.
It is what it is.
But anyway, I suppose we're at about time, so I'll wait another 30 seconds for formality's sake.
That was more than 3.
30.
3-0. Completely different. Still multiple of 3, though, very important.
Okay, well, oh yeah, Mike's picking up, good. So before we begin, I thought I would mention a small thing, which is that originally the Jove were intended to be a playable race in EVE. Obviously, this didn't come to pass, but it did result in some interesting circumstances. For instance, there was a Jove rookie frigate that was available in-game for the developers. And so, as you'd figure, a developer was rolling around one day in a Jovian rookie frigate, and as you'd figure, someone asked him for his mining laser because, hey, you know, trinkets? The developer, not quite realizing that a Tech 5 mining laser was a thing of value, handed it over. And that sort of betrayed an issue that the developers would face with bringing the Jove in as a playable race, that they would be out of scale in terms of balance with the rest of the races, and they were perhaps better used as this mysterious force for the story, which is actually best exemplified by a track in the old jukebox, the Jovian Riddle, which is where this presentation draws its name from. And it's actually a really fun track. If you get a chance to listen to it, we've been using it for our archives. And with that said, I'm Makoto Priano, and let's move on.
Xenoarchaeologists with the Arataka Research Consortium have announced further progress in the study of Jove cadavers retrieved from destroyed sleeper enclaves in drifter hive systems. Some success with dating some of the structures themselves was also announced. This effort has taken on additional urgency following recent developments in the ongoing drifter crisis. We go to ARC spokesperson Uriel Paradisi Antiovnoechi for more.
We've been aware of the principal Jove clone lines, statics and modifiers, for some time. What we now know is that while the Misubania tissue samples indicate additional modification, the contemporary Jove clone has roots that reach back over a millennium. Interestingly, the sleeper infrastructure found in the hives also dates back to the same period, the final days of the Second Jove Empire. Hive-site enclaves and other structures measure only slightly over 1,000 years in age at maximum, making these some of the last sleeper constructs established before the apparent collapse of their civilization. Dating the debris fields within the Nexus anomalies has proven impossible, however, due to interference from the strong energetic discharges emitted by the scattered structures comprising them.
Researchers continue to gather whatever material they can in the hope of untangling the mysteries surrounding the drifter crisis. This is Cerulean Voth
And Elinari Rodin
reporting in Eli for the Discourse.
It's sort of handy to be able to write the news yourself. So, hello. As you may have gathered, I'm Makoto Priano. I'm with the Arataka Research Consortium. We're a bunch of nerds that do story and drifter things. And I will probably be joined at some point on stage by Uriel, who will be helping with the Q&A portion of this. And it's definitely helpful to get some additional input on this because we've been able to talk about Jove stuff at length for weeks, months, years, and some of these mysteries, some of these riddles we haven't really begun to untangle. So, of course, that brings me to a point and a concern with regard to this presentation, because there's so much there's so much breadth, so much depth, that what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to try to bring us all up to a shared common level of understanding, and then we'll go to an extended tinfoiling and Q&A session once we're all up to a shared level of understanding, once we start all facing the questions that surround Jovian history. So that's say that basic level will be established by just going through the history in a linear fashion and then drilling down into the individual factions of Jove. And ideally we'll have about half the time for Q&A. But before we start talking about Jove, I want to talk about something that will probably make a professor of literature cringe, which is, say, Cyberpunk. EVE Online is without a doubt a cyberpunk game, and when I say cyberpunk, what I'm referring to is this genre of fiction where you're faced with questions of identity and purpose in the face of technology that renders you faceless and anonymous. It's even more pronounced in the case of the Jove because they have pursued this post-human ideal, this cyberpunk exploration of what it means to be human, to the point they've become almost a post-human Icarus, sailing, or rather flying too high, being burnt, and then crashing to the ground. So I'm going to end up referring a few times to elements of the Jovian story that are quintessentially post-human and really bring home questions that cyberpunk and postmodern literature deal with. But of course, we have to deal with the Jove to get there. And I should say that when I say Jove, it's in fact not just the Directorate Jove. It's not just the ones with the green ships that are really awesome that we all want to fly. It's not even necessarily the Jove and their immediate predecessors, the Second and First Empire Jove. It also applies to those factions of Jove that have split off. Like the Sleepers, for instance, are a Jovian faction. The Drifters, depending on your definition and depending on what they actually are, might also be a Jovian faction. For that matter, the Triglavian Collective, if what we're guessing is right, might also be a Jovian faction, though of course obviously we don't know yet. So today, when I say Jove, It's going to be the big picture, and I'm going to attempt to be very specific when I'm talking about Directorate Jove, or Sleepers, or other factions like the Elders. So this was done by Adra Lefisk of Aderon Robotics a few years ago in old hydrostatic podcast days, and this is a pretty good basic sketch of the factions that are involved. And you can see that if this were on like a cork board, you would have strings everywhere tying them together. But the important thing is that the story overall is actually fairly linear until you get to, well, the point where it naturally becomes chaotic, because inevitably that's what happens with all history. But we may as well start with the beginning. And this is in fact actually a story as old as New Eden itself, because the Jove were among those first colonists, or rather the colonists to pass through the Eve Gate. They were actually some of the last colonists to pass through before its collapse, but what's worth noting is that in their early days they were radically different from what we know them as now. They were poor, they were technically inept. I honestly sort of think of them as space Amish, except instead of raising barns, they're raising stargates. And because they expected to have no lifeline back to old Earth, they actually weathered the Dark Ages significantly better than any other faction, which is one of the reasons why they have had so much time to develop. And of course, the period of the most profound development, that's say when they became, well, when they transformed from space Amish to a proper empire, is the period that we refer to as the First Empire, spanning a vast period of 8,000 years, which I'm sure there's a lot of history there, but it's also ancient history, and so we don't know it. But we do know is how it ended, which is to say that a faction that used Jovian biotechnology to enhance their lifespan came into power. These are the Elders. And they sort of thought that, well, perhaps the Jove had reached the pinnacle of development. Perhaps they had developed far enough. Perhaps they had explored enough and expanded enough. And perhaps they should just call it good where they were. But as you would imagine, sort of like a pressure cooker on a stove, it did not go well, especially when that pressure cooker is left too long without tending. And so the First Empire collapsed into civil war and bloodshed. Of course, all collapses must be arrested at some stage, and this one, fortunately, had actually been stopped before the complete collapse of the First Empire, and a second empire rose from essentially the ashes or the detritus of the first. And this was under the first tyrant, Miko Bor. And I know your first inclination when you hear tyrant is go, but this isn't the modern sense where we have this sort of dictatorial, autocratic, a very cruel sort of a connotation with it. Think of it more in the classical sense, where tyrant was essentially like a king, except not a king, which is notable because the Second Empire Jove actually elected their leadership from their leadership councils. That say the tyrant had considerable power, but he came from the ranks of leaders, and so there was at least some element of politics and meritocracy that prevented things from stagnating too much. Of course, the Second Empire is also when the Jove became what we would most recognize as Jove. They became a people of clones, of infomorphs. The statics and modifiers, the factions that we end up knowing in the modern day, are first established here. And naturally, there are shady things going in the background, as there inevitably are, and as with all empires, inevitably it collapsed. But how it collapsed is something that continued to mark the Jove basically until modern day. And this is the Jove disease. There is a bit of it that we know in the lore, but it is still fairly mysterious. What we know is that it's a wasting neurological condition that has two effects. For Jove clones that have already been birthed and reached maturity, it's sort of like dementia in that it essentially eats away the brain, and it renders them in the end catatonic. But it also caused essentially the bricking of Jove clones in gestation. So this was a species that was entirely reliant on this technology, on cloning, to reproduce by the end of the Second Empire. And that technology itself was essentially ineffective in the face of the Jove disease. Of course, there were other factors. There was civil war, there were various factions that were accusing each other of being the cause of the disease or not doing enough to stop it. As inevitably happens, the empire fragmented to a great degree. And this is the point at which wormhole space is formed as we know it, that the sleepers are closed off from the rest of New Eden. And also, this might be the period where the Talakan also evacuate from wormhole space, because as you might recall, if any of you have lived there, there are recurring themes of disease and evacuation. And the guess is that that's either because of the Jove disease or the others, which we'll get to in a bit. But as inevitably happens, the Jove did not die in their fullest form. They attempted to form a third empire, and they were to some degree successful. They were few in number. The Shrouded days were essentially a black box of history that they knew as a near brush with extinction. As a people, they were nearly wiped out. And what's interesting about this is that for the Jove, considering their lifespans, they remember the Shrouded days much as we might remember World War II. It is in recent memory for the Directorate Jove that this happened, that they managed to avoid extinction. Of course, while they were few in number, while they were infinitely weakened, they were still rather more vigorous than we might give them credit for. For instance, they can be credited to some degree with the independence of the Minmatar Republic. They most certainly provided the Kaldari with capsule technology, which, hey, we all use, which preserved the Kaldari state in the face of the Galactic Federation's attempt to reunify the Federation. And so they made a tremendous mark on modern New Eden. But, well, that essentially brings us to modern day. And you might be wondering, that lightning tour of history is like, where does it come from? Because it's not from a single place. You can't just go, oh yeah, that's all of it, that's cool. And because EVE Online as a game in a world has been developing now for over 15 years, the first Chronicles were being released well before the release of the game, and there are a lot of potential sources for Jove lore. You get something like EVE Source, which is a fairly broad sort of empire perspective understanding of Jovian history. Then you have something like Templar 1, which gives you a very specific narrow dive into sleeper lore from the perspective of one of the factions directly involved, to the point actually that it's hilariously biased at points, where, you know, the character who is essentially a mind scrape of a Directorate Jove who is hunting the Enhedwani and then shipped back as an AI-altered version of that Jove to tell the story of the Enhedwani, basically says that the Directorate Jove are the progeny of the Sleepers. I'm pretty sure the Directorate Jove would disagree, but okay. But in any case, what's relevant about this is that there are a number of authors, and there are a number of terms that are used in some authors' writings and not others. So we end up with this webwork of relationships that we have to trace out. And of course, then there are other chronicles, as you see there. The Jovian Wetgrave, Mithras Gate is a more recent one. We'll get into it more later. But let's start talking about the current state of all the Jovian factions so that we see where things lie as they are. And obviously, the Directorate Jove are the most familiar to us, and they're gone. I mean, that's as simple as you can put it. They're gone. Not dead. They specifically say that they are not necessarily dead, that they are gone. So you end up with this recurring theme in Jovian history where the Jove pack onto motherships in cryostasis and go away. It's like, okay, it's time for us to try again somewhere else. And so it's entirely possible that in that Tolkienian fashion, they've gone west. There might be millions or billions of Directorate Jove just sort of floating out in the dark, headed somewhere. And we might see them again, or we might never, or they might all die in a fire. Who knows? But of course, what's interesting is that while the Directorate Jove have essentially ceased to exist as an entity, their space is still there. Their stations are still there, sort of. Their stations are, of course, not being maintained. They're falling apart. They're rotting. Literally, it's called nanorot in the Inheritance Chronicle. So if we make it to Jove space, which, I mean, you know, hoping, it's entirely possible that we will find space completely bereft of any infrastructure, and we will end up having to be the ones to create all of the stargates and the stations that we use. So whereas the rest of nullsec, you've got the gate network pretty much figured out, in Jove space, maybe that won't be the case. Maybe you'll have to figure out how to get from one system to the other, link stargates, and colonize in all senses of the word. Of course, this is completely tinfoil. I'm sure a developer would go, oh God, please don't say that. But that's sort of the vision that I imagine at least someone at CCP has. What's also noteworthy, though, is that there were a bunch of Jovian corporations that were operational in New Eden, in known space. And many of these corporations had in fact been staffed by regular humans. So there might be a few Jove who had been left in these organizations, but they still functioned even in the absence of the Jove, which is where the society comes in, because they were well and truly the beneficiaries of the Jovian Directorate's legacy. They have immeasurable technology that they have been bequeathed by the Jove, and they also have considerable political power. And this is a relatively recent thing. Like, the society has always been there as a sort of shady, totally an educational institution, totally not a shadow government type of thing. Make of it what you will. But they are also advocates for the Capsuleer in the way that so many other powers in New Eden aren't. I mean, the Sisters of Eve, the really totally not creepy ones, would love all of the Capsuleers to die in a fire. And there's actually a book about that. It's called The Burning Life. In any case, the society is a major player, and in fact, without a doubt, they have been at the center of some major events in recent years, to the fact that, in theory, Fanfest is happening at a Society of Conscious Thought consulate in July 3. Random facts. And then, of course, we get to progressively more mysterious Jovian factions, like the Sleepers. Yes, I do call them Schrodinger's Jove. It's because they're locked in a server, and we have no idea if they're dead or not. Simple as that. And by that I mean say, well, yes, okay, they're alive, sort of, accepting that they don't even know that they're in reality. They are another of those cautionary post-human tales where they have taken to virtual reality to such a degree that they don't realize that they're not in the real world. So as we're all destroying sleeper drones for a tasty, tasty, delicious salvage to build T3Cs, which, you know, hey, awesome. We might be committing genocide. Maybe. Yes, almost certainly. But what's worth noting is that with the catastrophic destruction of their infrastructure, we don't necessarily even know how well networked that virtuality, that sort of matrix-like construct that they live in is. So it could be that there are untouched, pristine virtualities where, you know, they're sort of like, oh yeah, we're aware of what's going on, and we just sort of don't care. Or there might be other ones where they're essentially in a nightmare state where they are locked in the pods from the Matrix, sort of going, get me out of here, and of course being trapped. We really don't know. Which of course leads us to the next we really don't know faction. So in wormhole space, you have the Talakan and the Sleepers, and we'll get to the Talakan, believe you me. But the others are another one that exist, that are mentioned in the lore. And these are essentially sort of like Agent Smith, except sleeperified. They arose naturally in the construct as a product of essentially leaving a server running for a few thousand years, which I'm sure for anyone who does IT sounds like a great idea. But somehow, evidently, you get like artificial sophants who don't really like life or artificial reality out of it. Or at least in some cases you do. I'm sure in other cases they are in fact cooperating with the Sleepers. I'm sure in other cases they are totally Skynet. We don't know. And because we don't know how the Sleeper infrastructure is connected or whether it is, there could be millions of stories of how the Sleepers and the others interact in the virtuality. Of course, when we talk about the others, inevitably we also have to talk about our favorite Jovian faction, the Drifters. Notably, we have no idea still who the Drifters are. There are lots of guesses. Oh, believe you me, we guess all the time. But the simple thing is that we have pointers in multiple directions. And I know that first bullet point sort of like, what? Named suggestively? Come on, guys. But Honestly, it's true. Just from the name itself, drifters. Okay, they were adrift? Were they drifting purposefully? Where were they drifting? They're from the depths of wormhole space. What does that mean? They didn't come from wormhole space as we know it. Did they come from the shattered systems? Did they come from elsewhere? Were they from far, far away, and then when Carolyn's star blew, they went, oh, that was the direction we were meant to be going? We don't know. But of course, another of their names, the Vigilant Tyrannos, watchful tyrants. Tyrants, where have we heard that one before? So they could also be Second Empire Jove who had been trying to find a cure for the Jove disease and came back to New Eden to find that, what's going on here, dudes? What are these people? They don't look like Jove. We don't like that. But of course, whatever we make of the drifters, it's clear that they have advanced space-time manipulation technology. They have recurring themes of corruption, which could play any number of roles, including tying them with the others or possibly other Jovian factions. But of course, they could be not alive by any measure whatsoever. The drifters are essentially reanimated sleeper cadavers, or Jovian cadavers, brought to some semblance of life through advanced cybernetics, and we don't know what's riding around in that meat puppet. And I mean, I call it meat puppet for a reason, because they may as well just be AI drones that are piloting Jovian bodies and sort of going, cool, I have a body now, that makes me a person, right? What's interesting is that there is a mention in the Inheritance Chronicle of a Talican stellar lattice, a Dyson swarm, whatever you want to call it. It's a massive array of wormhole generators in sort of a sphere around a star. And this has defenses against AI intrusion. The Talican really did not like artificial intelligence. And interestingly, in the Drifter Hives, you have the Nexus, which we first encounter as the spiky space urchin-y thing. We found it like that, and then when we next saw it, it was completely destroyed. Now, presumably the Drifters didn't destroy it, but if they are no longer recognized as human by Talican technology, what's to say a Talican defense didn't just go, screw this, gate's gone, sorry guys. We don't know, but it would explain why players have to be the ones to align that infrastructure. But I digress. Of course, then we get to yet more mysterious factions, and I put them on the same slide for a reason. The Enhedwani are a faction mentioned solely in the writing of Tony Gonzalez. They are a naturally mysterious, shady, shadow government type. They are a Jovian faction that is attempting to suborn and direct the development of New Eden, of all of us, and they were once upon a time the caretakers of the sleepers. Interestingly, in Tony Gonzalez's writing, he never once, a single time, mentions the Talican. In Wormhole Space, you never once see mention of the Enhedwani. The Talican are everywhere, which sort of raises this question. It's like, okay, if the Enhedwani are masters of space-time manipulation and teleporting and were the caretakers of the sleepers, and in Wormhole Space you have the Talican who are masters of space-time technology and clearly had some sort of involvement with the sleepers if they coexisted, which is still a question, but I think it's sort of, it's not settled, but I consider it settled. Let's move on. It could very well be that these factions are in fact the same, simply known by different names. CCP, of course, won't ever confirm that because they'd like that we guess. And then we get to these guys. Yeah, I'm sure you were waiting for this one. So obviously the presentation had to be submitted a couple of weeks ago, so there were some uncertainties as to what would be going on. A few. They might be a Jovian faction. I say might. I'm sure that in about 3.5 hours, when we get to the lore panel, Delegate Zero will laugh and then crush all my theories. You nod, but it's true. It's true. But the relevant thing is that there was a chronicle very sneakily released a month and a half ago by the name of Mithra's Gate. And I'm going to dive deeply into this one because it's really juicy. It was one of those little throwaway chronicles that has lots of hints, and given its timing, So first, just the name of the chronicle, Mithra's Gate. Mithra is a Zoroastrian god of oaths binding, judgment, light, order. Interesting. It also references Roman Mithraic cults, which we don't know much about. We know very little about these, excepting that they were mystery cults, that they had orders of initiation, that they had ceremonies that were conducted in hidden places beneath places of power. There are thousands of Mithraic temples that are known, but we know nothing of the civilization, or rather of the cult that built these, or I should say very little, which sounds sort of familiar, doesn't it? I mean, you know, abyssal dead space, hidden places, people doing secret things. But then we get into the actual content of the chronicle itself. And in this, an angel cartel rebel type is exploring a Jovian Second Empire installation. And there are a lot of multiples of 3 that are in there, like 6 banks of clone capsules for stored clones. 3 of them are empty. A thing for entangling communications between Jovian biotech implants that has 3 implants. So Triglav is a Slavic god figure that is a 3-headed god, king of the underworld, the earth, and heaven. Alternatively, portrayed with a human head, or rather 3 human heads with blindfolds so that he can see and speak of no evil, or 3 goat heads because, hey, cool, let's roll with it. What if the Triglavian Collective, what if at the most basic level, their solution to some of the troubles and the fractiousness that the Jove are facing was to bind 3 Jove as one? So you have 3-faced Jove, 3 Jove who communicate, whose minds are linked and shared. And so, for instance, you'll notice a lot of the times that we see Triglavian ships, they're also in 3s, interestingly. So that's a little bit of tinfoil. Honestly, we don't know terribly much at all about them, but it is entirely possible or even likely that the Triglavian Collective is a Jovian faction. So hey, that'll be fun to figure out more about, and I'm sure we will learn a bit, but not enough to resolve that mystery in the months to come. So before we get to a more interactive Q&A and tinfoil session, I just want to give some quick shout-outs to all the people who've been flying with us, who've been doing decryption work, who have been doing all sorts of other work of that sort. I should note that this list we did have to submit, or rather I submitted as part of the presentation weeks ago, so it's not up to date, which really sucks, to be honest, because there are a lot of people who deserve a lot of credit for what we've been doing, and it's been hilariously fun. So that said, yeah, we may as well tinfoil some. I mean, we've got the time, I think. So let's go for it. Who has a question or a thought? Oh, and hey, we have a mic. We've got 2 hands there.
Thank you. Hello. So I had quite some questions, so I don't know how many I get.
Let's do one at a time. That way everyone has a turn.
So I must choose. Yeah, of course.
I mean, hey, lists are good. I like lists.
Okay, so my first question was about the influence of Jove society on the actual shape of New Eden, because you mentioned the Mithras Gate Chronicle, and in it we learned that the Jove installation they visit is actually the comet that led the Amor Retribution. So we can guess that with the Jove observatories that the Jove pretty much shaped the empires. Yes, no? What are your predictions?
So, okay, so let me restate just to make sure I've got it, because did not sleep well last night. Anyway, moving on. So the question is basically about whether there's a link between the Mithras Gate Comet Outpost and Jove observatories, and whether the Jove observatories are Second Empire Jove, Directorate Jove, or like who they're linked to, basically.
It's much more on how much of the Jove shaped New Eden, actually.
Okay, yes. In that case, yes. So here's an interesting thing that Amar loyalists will probably go, So The earliest days of the Amar faith involve a situation, a miracle, and I used the glad hands for that for a reason, where these masked figures come down on a pillar of fire from heaven, the Sephrim, and they are masked, and they extend the life of Amashakura, I think. I'm not an Amar specialist by any means, so I'm probably going to get a lot of this wrong. But anyway, so these Sephrim come down from on high and preserve the life of this one favored Amar ruler for centuries. And over this period, the Amar religion expands and they establish themselves as the dominant force on their world. Coincidentally, the dates of this more or less coincide with the later period of the first Jovian Empire, when the elders were doing their thing and were really great with life extension technology, which also happened to be something that was employed, we assume, with this Amar emperor, assuming, of course, that it wasn't in fact miracle, but was in fact, oh hey, advanced aliens, and by aliens I mean Jove, going, we want to see what happens with this religion. So, as to the question of whether or not the Jove have been deeply involved in the history of New Eden, the answer is yes, absolutely. For instance, I mentioned that they were also involved in the Minmatar Rebellion and the establishment of the Republic. Yeah, they were the ones to use spooky Jovian cloaky industrials to transport Galente small arms and heavy weapons across the border into what would become the Republic. So there have been points where they have been impressively hands-on. So yes, the Jove have a great deal of involvement. So.
Yeah, I have two questions, but they are short. The first one is, could it be possible that the Triglavians are not related to the Jove, but that they might be Talocan? I mean, they live in some sort of weird space pocket. I mean, that's very Talocan stuff. The other thing is, I remember back in the days when the observatories appeared, we would be speculating hours and hours who built them and what they were for. Has there been any development on that speculation in the meantime?
Okay, so the first question is whether or not the Triglavian Collective could be Talocan in nature, and absolutely that is sort of one of my preferred pet theories at the present. We don't necessarily have anything to directly link them. It would make sense for, this secret society of Jove who were attempting to guide New Eden to be hidden away amongst us the entire time. And certainly advanced space-time manipulation technology is something that would link those two factions, considering that I'm sort of the mind, though it's not confirmed, that the Talocan are themselves the Jovian faction. So yes, I agree that is a fascinating theory, and I want to see more that would possibly allow us to confirm it or deny it. It's still too tenuous for us to do much more than theorize on that. As to the Jove Observatory infrastructure and which faction might be responsible for that, so what's interesting is that if you review the gleaned information logs that you get when you entosis those Jove observatories, on which note, backstory, oh hey, you can entosis Jove observatories and they give you like little history logs from New Eden as the Jove are monitoring and going, yes. The last of those logs is actually from basically at the point where the Jove observatories are being decloaked. So considering that they started decloaking during, or rather as a possible product of Carolyn's star, and considering that they were active in a period where the Directorate Jove were already in the process of evacuating, and considering also some of the interesting, we're using New Eden as a petri dish stuff, it would certainly make sense for the observatories to actually be Enhedwani installations. Again, this is one of those tinfoil things where, interestingly, from a technical standpoint, there are a lot of things in the database that are Sleeper, Drifter, Jove, Talocan, that all end up sort of randomly having their race attributes scattered between any of those. So like the Drifter Hive is a Jove station, the Jove Observatory is a Jove station, Drifter battleships are Jove battleships. It'll be interesting to see what the Triglavian Collective go into the database as. Actually, wait, we should probably look at that. Anyway. Oh, yeah.
They're in as a
because
model
placeholders,
battleships at the moment.
yeah. We're pretty sure those are placeholders, though. Okay, next up.
Tinfoil. The Triglavians or Yin Jung or another one of the Cosmos factions that haven't been used yet.
So the Yanjung are certainly a possibility because they are also mentioned as being masters of gravitational manipulation, which would also link them in. And that's the one that really hasn't been touched at all. So interesting backstory, the Cosmos constellations, if I'm recalling correctly, were made during a period when EVE Online was sort of, or rather CCP was playing with more theme park content. And what they realized that, well, people were playing with it, but it wasn't really getting the traction. And oh, hey, when we do sandbox stuff, that's what people like. So to a very significant degree, those factions were sort of throwaway, but they have picked up threads and built on them in a major way, hence Talican and Sleepers originally being in Cosmos constellations and on. You already know this, I'm just saying this for everyone else. But yeah, it is entirely possible that they could also be Yangjong. But that's again one of those things where it's like, we have to see what they do with it. So, next.
I sort of preface this with like, I'm not really into the lore that much, but this Triglavian type stuff, being able to go into like mad deep space, does that not sound like technology that the Eve Gate encompasses? Could they not be, you know, people straight up from old Earth?
Okay, so I will admit that I did miss some of that, but I did catch the end, which is deep
So
space
basically,
and
are
then
the
old Earth.
Triglavians from old Earth? The technology that we use to go into this deep dead pockets of space sounds a lot like the Eve Gate to me.
Yeah, so we get into sort of tenuous territory there. CCP has, like some of the developers have said that they don't ever want to do like Terran stuff because it sort of like, it breaks the coherence of the story of Eve to suddenly have something from way out over there. The flip side is, though, that Terran technology is at various points either discussed as being supremely powerful or really sort of crappy. Like, for instance, like the warp drives in Templar 1 that are used by the original settlers are slow, like 0.00000075 AU a second or something, like just above the speed of light. Imagine trying to run a freighter around like that. I mean, yeah, exactly. Imagine the acceleration, that'd be terrible. But anyway, but by comparison, you also have the super weapon used by Jamil, which has actually been brought into the game generally as the Keepstar super weapon, which is a pretty nasty little weapon right there. And so, you know, some places that technology is extremely advanced. So could it be that, in fact, the Triglavian Collective is a collection of uncollapsed humans that never faced a dark age? Conceivably. I mean, as said, we don't really have many pointers, so there are a lot of options out there, which is why I go to Mithra's Gate so much for it, because it could be the only indication we have at present. But again, that could just have been something thrown out there to start making us look at numerology and go, what? Next.
Considering that the E-Floor is about now more than 15 years old.
Yes.
And there were a lot of older authors and storytelling writers that are long gone.
Mm-hmm.
Is it conceivable that the new Triglavians and Drifter have absolutely nothing to do with the old storyline, and that you're trying to fit the evidence to the theory instead of the theory to the evidence?
So, yes, absolutely. That is a thing that should be considered at any point, which is why it's important, for instance, to recognize that, for instance, the Triglavian could just be a completely new faction of people with no connection to any prior faction. I will say two things, though. At one point, I was harassing the lore developers, as you do, and I was commenting on inheritance and going, so now we know X. And in the course of this discussion, the developer in question said, well, we've never done any public-facing retcons. And I was sort of like, but there are documents that completely disagree on things. They take a lot of like jumping through hoops to reconcile them. And of course, he naturally responded that, well, yes, but they're all from the perspective of someone in the universe. Much as Templar 1 is, you know, this Enhedwani altered AI version of a Directorate Jove's brain, or Eve's source is sort of like a general empire briefing, or so on and so forth. A lot of these can be reconciled if you assume that there is an unreliable narrator. And also, this does get to the fact that the lore developers tend to love leaving a lot of loose ends. Drives us up a wall, but the flip side means that there are always threads that they can go back to and pull on to start a new story, and it enhances the weave. So absolutely, you're quite right that the Drifters could be something completely new. They could be something that we can't really account for on that basis. Likewise, the Triglavian Collective. I think we have to be wary anytime we start positing theories, which is why, you know, I like put on the tinfoil hat. What if, because it's entirely possible, as I said before and will say again, that in about like 3.5 hours, Delegate Zero will destroy all my theories, and I'll be in a corner crying. Okay, so...
I've been out of the lore loop for a little while, so maybe I've missed a few things. But has there been any further, well, not necessarily information on the other presence with former Empress Jamil, or?
Okay, so what's interesting is, so we get a differentiation between the other as a singular entity and the others as the entity in the sleeper construct, or the entities, plural. So the other as a single entity was the subject of the Inheritance Chronicle, and also naturally of the Drifters' murder, death, killing Empress Jamil I. The basic idea being that probably the Drifters didn't like the other, hence the murder, death, kill, and the potting, and then going, see ya guys. It is a theory of some that the Drifters may have used that potting to scrape the infomorph to capture or reclaim the other. I don't think we have any indication of it, necessarily beyond pet theories. So we just sort of have to look at potential biases of the lore writers. And in this case, there are some spirited debates about the quality of Tony Gonzalez's writing and characters that he had a great deal of involvement in developing, Empress Jamil being one of them. So certainly it seems like the lore devs just wanted to axe that character and also have fun stuff for the Amar to do. And that may also mean that they wanted to axe the other, or they might have something in store there. This is one of those loose ends that could just lead nowhere, or it could become quite weighty. Of course, it is worth noting that they have confirmed the continued existence of the others as sort of a demographic thing in sleeper enclaves. So I think that fellow next, May, and then back down to the front and so on. So. Thank you, SG.
No problem. Well, I think one of the more interesting things to consider about the Triglavians is why do they even live in that space that they're living in if it's so hostile? Because even if you take the stance that life will fill any niche that that's there, that's left open, it's still a very hostile environment. So
that's fair.
What are they hiding from, or what drove them to hide in such places?
That is indeed a question. So my first comment is I would like to note that we're currently in Iceland. So insofar as the demographic matter of populations filling all available niches are concerned, there is something to be said for that. But also, yes, there is most certainly a question as to why they are in those spaces and why they haven't gone elsewhere. Some of it is likely to be that Okay, this is going to be a lot of tinfoil. I'm just going to start throwing out theories. What if they're hiding from the Jove disease? What if they, in fact, were never corrupted by it, if they never caught it, they closed off their instances the moment it struck? Plague Inc., they're Madagascar. I'm not sure anyone has played that. Okay, you got it, good. So that could be one thing. Possibly they are a singular faction that decided that they didn't want to try bothering with the Jovian political scene again, which tends to be like the rise and dramatic fall of empires with lots of war in between. And that might also be one of the reasons why, for instance, the Jove are attacking, or not the Jove, the Drifters are attacking them now. They've discovered these hidden places. They are attempting to unify the Jovian Empire, or they're attempting to steal technology, or they just want more Jove corpses because they're useful. There are any number of potential reasons for the attack, and there are at least a couple of decent reasons for why they might be hiding away. Certainly you would think that in the aftermath of the fall of the Second Empire, they could have reemerged. It's possible some of them did. We really don't know much at all. When it comes to Jovian history, we have only the barest outline. So, okay.
Sorry, I'm just jumping in here.
He'll be next up.
I've got not so much as a theory, but do you have any theories on why the Triglavian and the Drifters are fighting if they are both Jovian?
So one of the things that I didn't actually touch on, I had sort of meant to, but, you know, getting through the points to get to the fun bit. The Jove have always been very factional. Their empires have been held together by the grit, guile, and sheer bloody-handedness of their various makers of empire, which is one of the reasons why they've had so many experiments to attempt to deal with the less pleasant aspects of humanity. The Jove disease essentially sprang from an effort to cull negative human traits from the genome, like hate and anger and so on and so forth. Hence the, you know, the story of a post-human Icarus. So why are they fighting? Well, why do we humans fight? I mean, when it gets down to it, there are any number of potential reasons why the Drifters would want to attack the Triglavians, even if they're a Jove faction. Unifying the Jove under one banner, usable technologies that the Drifters don't have. They're attempting possibly to further advance their space-time manipulation technologies so they can possibly reactivate Talakan technology. Perhaps the Drifters are even fallen Talakan who want to regain their great heights. Perhaps they think the spaces are great and they want to move in. I mean, you know, difficult to access Drifter bases all through New Eden. That would be a great time for the rest of us. Or perhaps it's something as simple as like, oh, they like rogue drones. We do not like rogue drones. Let's kill them all. Okay. So.
Thank you. I'm just going to take 1 minute to say one of my theory about the fight between Drifters and Triglavian. In my opinion, it's about the mutagenic thing. It's clearly an early theory. It waits to have more information. But with the announcement of the mutagenic thing, I have my hypothesis that the Joves are trying to fix the disease with the mutagenic thing, because it's a biological thingy. Mm-hmm. So it could work.
Okay, so with apologies, as I'm a bit hard of hearing and I missed half that. So I did catch the bit on biotechnology and it working being the attempt to use biotechnology to, could someone with better hearing repeat? Thank you. Sorry, it's
basically the idea that the biological components that are available in abyssal space are going to be used to cure the Jovian disease, essentially.
Yeah, that could certainly be a thing.
An actual question.
So for my actual question, it was more about another one of the other shadowy figures of New Eden, the sister of Eve. You briefly mentioned them in the Society of Conscious Thought slide, and I wanted to know if there is any proof of relation between the Sister of Eve and the other, but singular, because in the Sister of Eve arc, we see them work peacefully with rogue drones, and we know that they worked too with sleepers, drifters. It's kind of piling up.
So the society is an interesting one. So there are a few ways to approach this. I'm going to start from a very rogue drone-centric angle. The first thing to note is that we don't necessarily know what made the rogue drones all go rogue at the first time. That could easily have been the influence, well, it could just have been random. It could have been the influence of another rogue artificial intelligence like the Others. It could simply be that, oh hey, some other faction went, that's a useful resource gathering tool, let's suborn it. We do see in a number of cases rogue drones being suborned using Jovian technology. As you say, the Society of Conscious Thought in the Sisters of Eve epic arc. We also see it mentioned in the End of the World Chronicles, where a shadowy Jove figure gives, I think it's a Thucker pilot, a means to, actually wait, no, it's Blood Raider and then the Thucker is the, right, gives the Blood Raiders the means to temporarily control some rogue drones that are refueling this Terran superweapon. And in another case yet, we have confirmed that rogue drones will be used by the Triglavian Collective to fill out their numbers. So it's certainly the case that when it comes to very strange, creepy, automated rogue drone infomorph control, insofar as rogue drones have infomorphs, let's move on, there is a curious and recurring connection in Jovian technology between the Jove and the rogue drones. What it means? Good question. Let's go with Nomi.
Are the drifters and or the Triglavians capable of diplomacy?
Yeah. So, fair question, totally not pointed. So, I think after this we might have time for one or two more, even though the room isn't really taken, probably should not go over an hour. Anyway, there was an interesting thing that was required of by CCP when the Drifter Autopsy was written. So that was done by a number of players who were given more or less free hand by CCP to fill in the backstory behind the precise placement of the Drifter implants. They've got a lot of cybernetics in their head. But the one thing that CCP made sure was included is that the vocal cords were specifically rendered inoperable and the jaw was fused. So while this is clearly a thematic theme, as opposed to like, oh, well, they can't speak. Well, what about speakers or something? The intent is to demonstrate that the drifters either do not value or are actively attempting to prevent individual drifters or drifter drones, whatever you want to call them, from communicating. And there are also interesting mentions in the description of the Tyrannos Strategos, essentially what we assume is sort of like the head general, sort of, that the drifters might actually be subject to outside control, that they may in fact be a network of drones that are centrally linked and being managed by some entity or entities. Of course, with the drifters, we have a lot of threads going a lot of directions. I half suspect that CCP just threw out those threads so that they could see what we started pulling on. Insofar as the Triglavian Collective is concerned, your guess is as good as mine. Certainly, it doesn't appear to be CCP's intent at this early phase that we will be able to act cooperatively with them. Whether they will want to communicate, certainly with the drifters, they had a specific aim of ensuring that we would not be friendly with them. But I think one more and then good? Good? That fellow right there?
We need to start
Yeah.
space because
And-
like, they can cut hands, I guess.
There would potentially be ways to communicate with them, even if it's not speech and verbal. I mean, if they're an infomorph society.
People who don't
Yeah.
use speech every day.
But of course, they don't attempt to communicate, and they haven't for years, so. But let's,
Okay, so the gentleman over there that's gone, but he said, why are they living in this hostile space? The technology that we use in-game to get to their space would suggest that they don't live in this space, and they are exploring for the technology as well in these areas to further progress themselves. Look at them as another player doing the same thing that we are. Why the hell would you live in that hellhole? Why would you live in a volcano? Like, no matter how highly advanced you are in technology, you're not going to live in a volcano.
yeah, so certainly the acquisition of technology and the containment of hostile technology is a recurring theme with the Drifters. When the NPE came out, the Drifters were specifically attacking Sisters of Eve acquisition of Drifter technology. So if you think about it as sort of like corralling the technical capabilities or reducing the technical capabilities of your enemy and increasing your own, I mean, the Drifters are there fighting the Triglavian for a reason, and certainly the acquisition of technology is, yeah, to me that would make sense as one of the primary things. But I think at this point, there are other presentations people should get to, so I think we'll call it a wrap. Thank you, thank you. And do feel free to hit me up when you see me wandering about. I can talk about this stuff all day, as you may have noticed. Oh, and if you haven't gotten them already, there are still pins up here, so feel free to swag yourself.